"You don't belong at this table," she said, loud enough for every glass, every fork, every carefully arranged place setting to hear her. For a moment, no one moved. Not my son. Not the guest seated just inches away. Not even the waiter who had just stepped forward with a bottle of wine, frozen mid-pour as if he suddenly realized he had walked into something he shouldn't have. I looked down at the linen napkin in my lap, smoothing it once with steady fingers, as though she had commented on the weather instead of my place in my own family. Then I lifted my eyes and met hers. Vanessa stood at the head of the table, one hand resting lightly on the back of Daniel's chair, her posture composed, her smile polite in that way that never quite reached her eyes. Around us, the room was warm with soft lighting and quiet conversation from neighboring tables, the kind of upscale restaurant where people came to celebrate milestones. Tonight was supposed to be one of those nights. My son's promotion. A family dinner. Something I had been looking forward to for weeks. I had even arrived early, 15 minutes ahead of the reservation, just to make sure everything was perfect. That was who I had always been in this family. The one who arrived early. The one who made things work. The one who belonged. Or so I thought. No one said a word. Not even Daniel. He kept his gaze fixed on his plate, his jaw tight, as if silence were the safest place he could hide. I noticed the small details instead. The way his hand didn't reach for mine. The way Vanessa's fingers curled slightly, possessive, against his chair. The way the seat beside him, my usual seat, had already been taken when I arrived, replaced without explanation, as if I were a last-minute guest instead of his mother. I smiled. Not because I found anything amusing, but because I understood something in that moment that I hadn't allowed myself to see before. Smiling was easier than asking questions no one intended to answer. I placed my napkin carefully on the table, aligning it with the edge of the plate as though precision still mattered here. Then I pushed my chair back, the soft scrape barely audible over the hum of the room. "Of course," I said quietly, my voice steady, controlled, practiced. No one stopped me. Not a single person reached out. Not even out of politeness. And that told me more than her words ever could. I stood up, smoothing the front of my dress, feeling every pair of eyes that dared to look, and every one that didn't. The air felt different standing than it had sitting. Clearer. Colder. I picked up my purse, light in my hand, as if I had already begun to let go of something heavier long before this dinner. As I turned to leave, I caught my reflection in the dark window beside our table. For just a second, I saw myself the way they must have seen me. Older. Replaceable. Convenient to move when necessary. But they were wrong. They just didn't know it yet. Because what they didn't realize, as I walked away from that table without another word, was that I had already started preparing for this moment days ago. And tonight wasn't the beginning of my humiliation. It was the beginning of their mistake. I did not go home that night right away. Instead, I walked past the row of parked cars and out toward the quiet end of the street, where the glow from the restaurant faded into a softer, colder kind of light. The air carried a faint chill, the kind that settles in once the sun has been gone for a while, and I pulled my coat a little tighter around me even though I had not felt cold inside. Not until now. I kept replaying the moment in my mind, not her words, but everything around them. The silence. The stillness. The way no one had shifted in their seat as I stood up, as if my absence required no adjustment at all. That was the part that stayed with me. I had spent years convincing myself that small things did not matter. That missed calls were accidents. That invitations that never came were simply oversights. That changes happened naturally when families grew and lives became busy. But standing there on that quiet street, I could no longer pretend that this had been sudden. It had been building, piece by piece, moment by moment, long before tonight. I thought about the last holiday dinner, when my usual place at the table had been moved to the far end. Without explanation. I thought about the phone calls that had grown shorter, then less frequent, then replaced by brief messages that always seemed to arrive hours after I had reached out. I thought about the way Vanessa had started answering questions that were never directed at her, speaking for Daniel as if he no longer had his own voice. At the time, I told myself it was nothing. That it was easier not to make things uncomfortable. Easier to adjust than to ask why. I reached the corner and stopped, watching a car pass slowly through the intersection, its headlights sweeping across the pavement before disappearing into the distance. For a moment, everything was quiet again. Too quiet. I realized then that what hurt the most was not what had been said, but what had been allowed. Daniel had not defended me. He had not even looked at me. And that silence had said more than anything Vanessa could have spoken. I let out a slow breath and glanced down at my phone. There were no messages. No apologies. No attempt to explain. Just an empty screen reflecting back at me, like the window I had seen earlier. Clear. Honest. Unavoidable. I slipped the phone back into my purse and stood there for another moment, letting the quiet settle around me instead of fighting it. Because the truth was, this was not the first time I had been pushed aside. It was just the first time it had been done so openly. So deliberately. And that was the difference. That was what changed everything. I turned and began walking back toward my car, my steps steady, unhurried. Each one felt lighter than the last, as if I had finally stopped carrying something that no longer belonged to me. They thought tonight had put me in my place. They thought I would go home and question myself, wonder what I had done wrong, try to fix something that had never been broken on my side. But they misunderstood something important. I had not been caught off guard. Not entirely. Because 3 days ago, I had already begun to notice things that did not add up. And once I started looking, I could not stop seeing them. 3 days before that dinner, I was standing in my kitchen early in the morning, the kind of quiet hour when the house still feels like it belongs to you. The sunlight came in gently through the window above the sink, catching the edge of the coffee cup in my hand. I remember thinking how still everything felt, how ordinary. That was before the first small thing caught my attention. It was not dramatic. It never is. I had called Daniel the night before, just to confirm the time for the dinner, and he had answered on the third ring, his voice distracted, like he was speaking from another room in his own life. He said 7 o'clock, but there was a pause before he said it, just long enough to feel like he was choosing his words instead of remembering them. I noticed that. I did not say anything. The next morning, I checked my email while my coffee cooled beside me, and there it was, a reservation confirmation forwarded to me from Daniel. The restaurant name. The date. The time. But something about it felt off. I looked at it longer than I should have, my eyes moving over the details again and again until I realized what it was. The number of seats. It listed 6 guests. Not 7. I sat there for a moment, letting that settle in. 6. There were supposed to be 7 of us. I counted in my head, slowly, as if I might have forgotten someone. Daniel. Vanessa. Myself. 2 of Daniel's colleagues and their spouses. That was already 6. I read the email again. 6 seats. My name was not written anywhere. Not in the notes. Not in the confirmation. It was a small thing. Easy to overlook. Easy to explain away. Maybe they had not updated the reservation yet. Maybe they assumed I would arrive with Daniel. Maybe it was nothing. That is what I told myself at the time. Because it is easier to believe in mistakes than in intentions. Later that afternoon, I stopped by Daniel's house to drop off a folder he had asked for earlier that week. I did not stay long. I never do anymore. The door was slightly open when I arrived, just enough for me to hear voices from inside. Vanessa's voice carried clearly, light but firm in a way that always seemed carefully measured. She was talking about the dinner. About seating arrangements. About keeping things balanced. I stood there for a second, not meaning to listen, but not able to walk away either. Then I heard my name. Not spoken with warmth. Not even with neutrality. Just mentioned, like a detail to be managed. There was a pause, and then Vanessa said something quieter, something I could not fully hear, followed by a soft laugh that did not belong to a happy moment. I stepped back before the words could become clearer. I remember adjusting the folder in my hands, straightening the papers inside as if that would somehow steady me. When I knocked, she opened the door with a bright smile, the kind that arrives too quickly to be real. She thanked me for bringing the folder, told me how much Daniel appreciated it, and asked if I was looking forward to the dinner. I smiled and said yes. Of course I did. Because that is what I had always done. I left shortly after, walking back to my car with the same quiet feeling I had that morning, but now it carried something else beneath it. Something heavier. Something I could not quite name yet. That night, I sat at my kitchen table long after the sun had gone down, the reservation email still open on my phone. 6 seats. I stared at that number until it stopped looking like a coincidence and started feeling like a decision. And that was the moment I realized that whatever was happening, it had already been planned. The next morning, I did something I had not done in a long time. I did not call Daniel. I did not try to clarify what I had seen or heard. Instead, I sat at my dining table with a pen in my hand and a blank notepad in front of me, the kind I used years ago to keep track of household expenses when every dollar mattered. The house was quiet again, but this time the silence felt different. It felt useful. I began to write down everything I could remember, not just from the past few days, but from the past year. Small things first. The holiday dinners where I had been seated farther and farther from the center of the table. The conversations where Vanessa answered before Daniel had a chance to speak. The decisions that seemed to already be made before I was ever included. Each detail on its own had been easy to ignore. Together, they formed something clearer. Something intentional. I paused when I reached the memory of the last time Daniel had visited my house alone. It had been months. Before that, he used to stop by on Sunday afternoons, sometimes bringing groceries, sometimes just sitting with me for an hour, talking about nothing important. That had slowly changed. First, the visits became shorter. Then they became scheduled. Then they stopped altogether. Now, if I wanted to see him, it was always through Vanessa's calendar, Vanessa's plans, Vanessa's space. I wrote that down too. Not as an accusation. Just as a fact. When I finished, I set the pen down and looked at the page. It was not dramatic. There was no single moment that explained everything. Just a pattern. Quiet. Consistent. Hard to argue with once you allowed yourself to see it. Around noon, my phone rang. The name on the screen made me hesitate for a second. It was Richard Hale, my late husband's attorney. I had not spoken to him in months. I let it ring twice before answering. His voice was calm, familiar, steady in a way that reminded me of a time when things had been simpler. He asked how I was doing. I told him I was fine. That word came easily. It always had. There was a brief pause on the line, the kind that suggested he was choosing his next words carefully. Then he mentioned something about reviewing documents, about making sure everything was still in order. He did not explain why. He did not need to. I felt something shift quietly in my chest, not panic, not fear, just recognition. I told him I would come by his office later that week. After the call ended, I sat there for a moment, staring at the notepad again. The list. The pattern. The small details that had led me here. And for the first time, I did not feel confused by them. I felt certain. I folded the page carefully and placed it inside a drawer, the same drawer where I kept documents that mattered. Not because I needed to hide it, but because I understood its value now. This was not about a dinner. It had never been about a dinner. It was about position. About control. About who decided who belonged and who did not. I stood up slowly and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street in front of my house. Everything looked the same as it always had. Neighbors going about their day. Cars passing by. Nothing outwardly changed. But inside, something had settled into place. I was no longer trying to understand what they were doing. I already knew. And once you know, you cannot go back to not seeing it. I turned away from the window and reached for my coat. There were a few things I needed to confirm. And I had a feeling that whatever I was about to learn would not surprise me anymore. Richard Hale's office had not changed in years. The same dark wood shelves lined the walls, filled with neatly arranged folders and leather-bound volumes that no one seemed to read anymore. The same faint scent of paper and polished furniture lingered in the air, steady and familiar. It was the kind of place that made everything feel official the moment you stepped inside. I arrived 10 minutes early. Old habits. I sat in the reception chair with my hands folded over my purse, watching the second hand of the clock move with quiet precision. No rush. No anxiety. Just a steady awareness that whatever I was about to hear would confirm what I already suspected. When Richard opened the door and greeted me, his expression softened in a way that told me he understood more than he was saying. He led me into his office and closed the door gently behind us. No interruptions. No audience. Just the two of us and whatever truth had been waiting. He did not begin with small talk. That was something I had always appreciated about him. Instead, he sat across from me, placed a thin folder on the desk, and rested his hand on top of it for a moment before sliding it toward me. I did not open it right away. I looked at him first. He gave a small nod, the kind that does not push, but does not leave room for avoidance either. So I opened it. The documents inside were orderly, precise, written in the careful language of people who know their words will carry weight. I scanned the first page, then the second, my eyes moving steadily, not rushing, not hesitating. And there it was. Not hidden. Not complicated. Just clear enough that it could only be ignored if someone chose to ignore it. Changes had been requested. Not by me. Not by Richard. By Daniel. Recent changes. Adjustments to ownership structures, access permissions, and certain financial arrangements that had once been simple and shared. Now they were shifting. Redirecting. Narrowing. I felt something settle inside me, not shock, not anger, just confirmation. Richard spoke quietly, explaining what had been filed, what had been initiated, and what had not yet been finalized. That last part mattered. Not yet finalized. There was still time. I turned another page, noticing the dates, the signatures, the small details that most people would skim over. Vanessa's name appeared more than once. Not directly. Never directly. But present in the background of decisions that did not originate from her, yet carried her influence. I closed the folder gently and placed my hand on top of it, mirroring the way Richard had done earlier. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was necessary. "Do you want to proceed?" he asked finally, his voice calm, measured. I considered the question carefully. Not the words themselves, but everything behind them. This was not about reacting. Not about confronting. Not about proving anything to anyone sitting at that table a few nights from now. This was about understanding the game that had already been set in motion and deciding whether I would continue to play by rules I had never agreed to. I looked down at the folder one more time, then back at him. "Yes," I said simply. Not louder than necessary. Not softer than needed. Just enough. Because I had seen enough to know that silence had been mistaken for weakness. And that misunderstanding was about to become very expensive for someone. I left Richard's office with the folder tucked neatly inside my bag, the weight of it far greater than the paper it contained. Outside, the afternoon sun felt sharper than before, the light reflecting off the pavement in a way that made everything look too clear, too defined. I walked to my car without rushing, each step measured, each thought settling into place with a kind of quiet precision I had not felt in a long time. There was no confusion anymore. No hesitation. Just a sequence of decisions that needed to be made, and for once, I would be the one making them. When I got home, I did not sit down right away. I moved through the house slowly, noticing things I had overlooked for years. The framed photographs along the hallway. Daniel as a child, standing in the backyard with a crooked smile and grass stains on his knees. Holiday mornings with wrapping paper scattered across the floor. A life that had been built carefully, patiently, one moment at a time. I paused in front of one photo longer than the others. Daniel at 16, his arm around me, both of us laughing at something I could no longer remember. I reached out and straightened the frame, though it had not been crooked. Then I walked into the kitchen and set my bag on the counter. The house was quiet again, but it no longer felt empty. It felt like a space that belonged to me entirely, without question, without negotiation. I opened the folder once more, reviewing the documents with a slower, more deliberate eye this time. Dates. Signatures. Transfers that had been initiated but not completed. Requests that required final authorization. My authorization. That was the detail they had underestimated. They had assumed I would not look closely. That I would trust without verifying. That I would remain exactly where they had decided to place me. I closed the folder and placed it carefully in the drawer beside the stove, the same drawer where I kept important documents, recipes I trusted, things that had proven their value over time. Then I reached for my phone. Not to call Daniel. Not yet. Instead, I scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I needed and pressed call. The conversation was brief. Professional. Clear. I confirmed what could be done, what needed to be filed, and what would remain exactly as it was unless I chose otherwise. When I ended the call, I set the phone down and stood there for a moment, letting the quiet settle around me again. This time, it did not feel like something to endure. It felt like something I could use. That evening, I prepared dinner for myself, something simple, something I did not have to think about. I set the table for one. One plate. One glass. One chair pulled out exactly where I wanted it. I sat down and ate slowly, without distraction, without the need to fill silence with conversation that did not mean anything. And for the first time in a long while, I realized I was not waiting for anyone to join me. I finished my meal, cleared the table, and washed the dishes with steady hands. Each movement felt intentional, controlled. Not reactive. Not emotional. Just deliberate. Before going to bed, I walked back into the living room and turned off the lights one by one, leaving only the soft glow from the lamp near the window. Outside, the street was quiet, unchanged, as if nothing had shifted at all. But inside, everything had. Because they were still moving forward with their plan, believing I had already been removed from the equation. And I was going to let them keep believing that. For now. The next day passed quietly, almost too quietly, as if the world had decided to give me space while I rearranged mine. I did not reach out to Daniel, and he did not reach out to me. That silence no longer felt accidental. It felt deliberate on both sides now. I moved through my morning routine with the same steady pace, making coffee, opening the windows just enough to let in the cool air, letting the house breathe around me. There was something grounding in that routine, something that reminded me I still had control over the things that mattered. Around midday, my phone buzzed. A message from Vanessa. Short. Polite. Carefully worded. She asked if I had made it home safely after the dinner, adding a line about how things had been a bit tense, and that she hoped there were no hard feelings. I read it once, then again, noticing what was not there. No apology. No acknowledgement. Just a soft attempt to smooth over something that had been anything but smooth. I set the phone down without replying. Not yet. Timing mattered now. Everything did. Later that afternoon, I drove to the bank. It was a place I had visited countless times over the years, familiar in the way that makes you stop paying attention to details. But this time, I noticed everything. The way the teller greeted me by name. The way my signature still held weight in the system, still carried authority that no one had questioned. I requested a review of my accounts, my access, every connection that had been quietly adjusted behind the scenes. The manager joined us shortly after, his tone respectful, his explanations clear. Nothing had been finalized. Not without me. That detail settled something inside me even further. I left the bank with copies in hand, each page another piece of confirmation that I had not been erased. Not yet. That evening, I returned home and placed the documents beside the folder from Richard's office. Side by side. Two sets of information telling the same story from different angles. It was no longer a suspicion. It was a pattern with structure, with intention, with direction. I sat down and looked at both for a long moment, not feeling overwhelmed, not feeling angry, just aware. Aware of how close they thought they were to completing something that did not belong to them. Aware of how certain they must have felt, sitting at that table, believing I had already stepped aside. I reached for my phone again and opened Vanessa's message. My thumb hovered over the screen for a second before I typed a short response. I told her I had made it home safely. That I appreciated her checking in. That I understood how busy things must be with Daniel's promotion and everything that came with it. The words were simple. Calm. Neutral. I read them once before sending, making sure they carried exactly what I intended. Nothing more. Nothing less. A few minutes later, she replied with a heart emoji and a brief message about looking forward to seeing me soon. I placed the phone down and let out a quiet breath. They were still comfortable. Still unaware. Still moving forward exactly as they had planned. And that was exactly where I needed them to be. Because the more certain they felt, the less careful they would become. And I had already learned that the most important details are the ones people reveal when they believe no one is watching. 2 days later, Vanessa called. Not a message. This time. A call. I let it ring once, then answered, my voice calm, measured, exactly as it had been in my reply. She sounded warm, almost eager, as if nothing had shifted at all. She said they were planning a small gathering that weekend, something informal, just a few people, and that it would mean a lot if I came. I listened without interrupting, noting the details she chose to include and the ones she left out. The location. Their house. The guest list, mentioned casually, as if it had not been carefully curated. Daniel's colleagues again. A few new faces. People who would not know me well enough to question anything they saw. I agreed to come. Of course I did. My answer came easily, the same way it always had. But this time, it carried something different underneath. Something she could not hear. After the call ended, I stood in the middle of my living room for a moment, letting the invitation settle into place alongside everything else. It was too convenient. Too well timed. They were moving forward, step by step, creating a version of events where I was present, but not central. Included, but not significant. A guest in a story that had once been mine. That evening, I chose my outfit carefully. Not extravagant. Not understated. Just precise. The kind of choice that does not draw attention, but does not disappear either. I placed the documents into a slim folder, the same one I had taken to Richard's office, and set it by the door. Not to use. Not yet. Just to have within reach. The next day moved slowly, each hour stretching in a way that made everything feel deliberate. I did not rush. I did not second guess. By the time evening came, I was ready in a way I had not been before that first dinner. Not emotionally. Not defensively. But strategically. When I arrived at their house, the lights were already on, warm and inviting, spilling out onto the driveway. I could hear voices inside, soft laughter, the clink of glasses, the familiar sound of people enjoying something they believed was entirely under their control. I paused for just a second before stepping out of the car, looking at the house the same way I had looked at that table. Not with uncertainty, but with clarity. Then I walked to the door and rang the bell. Vanessa opened it almost immediately, her smile bright, welcoming, perfectly practiced. She stepped aside to let me in, her voice light as she greeted me, as if we were picking up from a moment that had never been interrupted. I stepped inside, taking in the room slowly. The arrangement of chairs. The placement of people. The subtle shifts that revealed more than they intended. Daniel stood across the room, mid-conversation, his posture relaxed, his expression easy. For a brief second, our eyes met. Just a second. Then he looked away. I smiled. Not at him. Not at her. Just to myself, because everything was exactly as it needed to be. They were comfortable. Confident. Unaware. And that meant they were not watching closely. I moved through the room at an unhurried pace, greeting people, exchanging polite words, taking my place in a space they believed they had already defined for me. And I let them believe it. Because the moment had finally arrived, and this time, I was not the one being positioned. I was the one choosing when to step forward. I waited until the room settled into its rhythm before I moved. Conversations layered over one another, glasses lifted and set down, small bursts of laughter rising and fading in comfortable waves. It was the kind of atmosphere that made people feel safe, certain that nothing unexpected would interrupt the evening. That certainty worked in my favor. I stood near the edge of the room for a while, listening more than speaking, observing the way Vanessa moved through her guests with quiet control, the way Daniel followed her lead without realizing he was doing it. Everything aligned with what I had already seen. Nothing new. Just confirmation. When the moment felt right, I stepped forward. Not abruptly. Not with urgency. Just enough to draw a natural pause in the conversation closest to me. It spread gradually, like a ripple, until a few more voices quieted, then a few more. Vanessa noticed first. Her smile held, but something in her posture shifted, subtle but visible if you were looking for it. I met her eyes briefly, then looked past her, addressing the room. Instead. My voice was steady, clear, not raised, but carrying just enough to be heard without effort. I thanked everyone for being there, for celebrating with Daniel, for taking the time to be part of something important. Simple words. Familiar. Expected. Then I reached for the folder I had placed on the side table earlier, the movement unhurried, almost incidental. I opened it and held it lightly in my hands, not presenting it yet, just acknowledging its presence. I realized recently, I continued, my tone unchanged, that there have been a few misunderstandings regarding some family matters. The word misunderstanding settled into the room with a quiet weight. Not accusatory. Not defensive. Just precise. I glanced briefly at Daniel, then back to the guests. So I took some time to review everything carefully. I paused, not for effect, but because there was no need to rush. Silence has its own way of focusing attention. And I thought it would be best to clarify those details now, while we are all here. I placed the folder on the table in front of me and opened it fully, turning it so the documents faced outward. Not dramatically. Not forcefully. Just enough for those closest to see, and for the rest to understand that something had shifted. Richard's name was visible on the top page. So were the dates. The signatures. The portions that required authorization. Mine. I did not explain everything. I did not need to. The kind of people in that room understood documents like these. They recognized what was missing as much as what was present. I let the moment sit, then closed the folder again with the same calm motion. Nothing has been finalized, I said simply. Not without me. The room was quiet now. Not uncomfortable. Just aware. I looked at Vanessa then, meeting her gaze directly for the first time since I had arrived. Her expression had not broken, but the confidence behind it had shifted, just enough to be seen. Daniel stood still, caught somewhere between surprise and realization, as if something he had assumed was already done had suddenly been returned to the beginning. I did not wait for a response. I did not ask for one. Instead, I picked up my purse and stepped back from the table, giving the space back to them, to their guests, to whatever explanation they would choose to offer. Or not. As I moved toward the door, no one stopped me. Not because they did not want to, but because they no longer knew how. I reached the doorway and paused for a brief second, not turning back, not needing to. Everything that needed to be understood had already been said. Then I stepped outside into the cool evening air, closing the door quietly behind me, leaving them with something they had not planned for. Not my absence. But my presence, exactly where it mattered.